Have you ever wondered what really happens when an empath finally reaches the end of their journey after years of narcissistic abuse? Not the beginning, not the middle, but the very last phase, the moment when something inside of them breaks. But at the same time, something even greater is born. Stay with me, because what Carl Jung revealed about this transformation is not just psychology. It feels almost like a spiritual awakening. And once you hear it, you may never look at yourself or at toxic relationships the same way again. At first, the empath doesn't even realize they are in a cycle. They believe that love can fix what is broken. They think their deep sensitivity and patience can heal the wounds of the narcissist. Every silent treatment is excused, every manipulation is explained away, and every cruel word is swallowed with the hope that tomorrow will be different. This is the empath in their earliest phase, hopeful, forgiving, endlessly giving. But as Carl Jung warned, what we refuse to face in ourselves eventually appears in the world as fate. And so, the empath keeps attracting the same pattern, because deep inside, they have not yet seen their own shadow. But the final phase, that is something else entirely. It is the phase where the empath no longer begs for love, no longer bargains for respect, no longer sacrifices their soul for crumbs of attention. Instead, they enter what Jung might call the individuation process, the birth of the true self. And this shift is not quiet. It is powerful. It is life-changing. Imagine this. A woman sits alone in her room after another argument, her eyes swollen from crying, her heart pounding from anxiety. For years, she has tried to be enough. For years, she has blamed herself, thinking maybe if she were prettier, quieter, stronger, less emotional, things would finally work. Tonight, though, something different stirs inside of her. She doesn't cry the way she used to. She feels empty, but also strangely free. It's as if the chains that once held her so tightly have finally rusted and broken apart. This is the silent moment before the final phase begins. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That sentence is at the heart of the empath's final transformation. For the first time, the empath begins to choose, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but out of truth. They begin to see the narcissist not as a monster to fear, nor as a broken child to heal, but simply as someone who no longer has power over them. The spell is broken, and here's where it gets fascinating. The final phase is not about revenge or hatred or becoming cold. It is about becoming whole. The empath finally integrates the part of themselves they once rejected, the part that knows how to set boundaries, to say no, to protect their own heart without apology. It is as though the empath finally meets their shadow, and instead of being afraid of it, they embrace it. But this awakening doesn't happen overnight. It comes after years of pain, years of lessons, years of facing the same cycle until the soul can't take it anymore. And in this exhaustion, something magical happens. The empath stops chasing love outside and begins to look within. The silence that once felt unbearable now becomes a sanctuary. The loneliness that once haunted them now becomes freedom. The narcissist, of course, notices this shift. Suddenly, the empath is not reacting, not feeding the drama, not giving the emotional energy that once fueled the narcissist's control. And that silence terrifies the narcissist, because the final phase of the empath is not just healing, it is power. Quiet, unshakable power. This is where Carl Jung's insights into the human psyche feel almost prophetic. He wrote about how suffering, when integrated, becomes wisdom. The empath, after enduring so much, finally alchemizes their pain into strength. They become someone new, someone the narcissist can no longer touch, someone who can walk away without looking back. But what exactly happens inside the mind and soul of the empath during this transformation? How do they go from being broken to becoming unbreakable? And why did Jung believe that it is through our wounds that we find our greatest strength? That's what we're going to explore, step by step, as we uncover the final phase of the empath after narcissistic abuse. So stay with me, because this journey is not just about surviving abuse. It's about discovering the deepest truth of who you really are. The empath's journey is not a straight line. It feels more like a spiral, circling through pain, hope, disillusionment, and brief moments of clarity before falling back again. In the beginning, they cling to the idea that love will heal everything. They tell themselves, if I just give a little more, if I just forgive one more time, if I just stay quiet and patient, this storm will pass. But the storm never passes. It only grows. And yet, this persistence is not foolishness. It is compassion misdirected. The empath carries an ancient wound of their own, often buried in childhood, where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned, where silence or caretaking was the only way to feel safe. They are not weak. They are repeating an old story, trying to turn the ending into something different. Carl Jung explained this in his idea of complexes, those hidden emotional knots that replay themselves in our lives until we untangle them. Every time the narcissist withholds affection, the empath feels that familiar ache from years ago, that ache of not being seen. Every time the narcissist explodes in rage, the empath feels that old fear of being abandoned. And so they try harder, not realizing they are trapped in a cycle that has less to do with the narcissist and more to do with their own unfinished healing. But slowly, something begins to shift. It happens in subtle ways. The empath notices that their body is tired, their mind foggy, their joy missing. They realize they have stopped recognizing themselves in the mirror, and deep inside, a voice whispers, "This isn't love." At first, they push that voice away, too afraid of what it means. But the voice returns, each time louder, until they can no longer ignore it. This is the beginning of the unraveling. The empath starts to question the very foundation of the relationship. They begin to see the patterns, the lies, the manipulations, the cycles of charm and cruelty. And when they see it, truly see it, the spell weakens. Jung believed that consciousness is born the moment we bring what is hidden into the light. For the empath, this is the turning point. The illusion begins to crumble, and with it, the narcissist's control. But this awakening is painful. It is not a triumphant moment at first. It feels like betrayal, heartbreak, even despair. Because to admit the truth means to admit that all those years, all those sacrifices, all those tears were spent on someone who never intended to love them back. And yet, this is the necessary death, before rebirth. Something must shatter inside the empath for the new self to emerge. Like a seed that cracks before it grows, the empath's identity, once defined by self-sacrifice, begins to break open. In the middle of this storm, the empath often feels lost. They might try to leave, only to be pulled back by guilt or fear. They might go silent, only to break down when the narcissist shows them a drop of affection. It feels endless. But even here, change is happening. Each cycle leaves the empath less willing to play along, less willing to give away their soul. Each return feels more hollow, until eventually, there is nothing left to give. And this is where the final phase is born, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of exhaustion. The empath reaches a place where they simply cannot care in the same way anymore. They are too empty to be manipulated, too tired to be controlled. The tears dry up, the begging stops, the arguments fade into silence. This silence is not weakness. It is the first taste of power. Carl Jung often spoke about individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are by integrating all parts of ourselves, even the ones we fear. For the empath, Individuation begins here. They stop identifying only as the giver, the healer, the forgiver. They begin to embrace the part of themselves that knows how to protect, how to demand respect, how to stand alone. The shadow self, once hidden in shame, now becomes their ally. The narcissist, sensing this change, grows unsettled. Where once they could provoke a reaction, now they find indifference. Where once they could wound with words, now they are met with calm eyes. Where once they felt powerful, now they feel small. And so, they try harder, desperate to pull the empath back into the old dance. But it doesn't work, because the empath has entered the final phase. This phase is not about anger or revenge. It is about clarity. The empath sees the narcissist as they truly are, not a god to worship, not a victim to save, but a person trapped in their own unhealed wounds. And with that clarity comes detachment. The empath no longer feels the need to fix, to rescue, or to explain. They simply let go. This letting go is the most terrifying thing for the narcissist, because what they fear most is not hatred, it is indifference. And the empath, in their final phase, becomes untouchable through indifference. But here's the beauty of it. The empath doesn't just survive, they transform. They begin to rebuild themselves, piece by piece, discovering passions, dreams, and joys that were buried under years of abuse. They learn to sit in silence without fear. They learn to walk alone without shame. They learn that their worth was never tied to someone else's approval. And as they grow, they begin to radiate something new, not the desperate energy of someone seeking love, but the calm strength of someone who has found love within. People notice it. Friends, family, even strangers see it in their eyes. The quiet power of someone who has walked through fire and come out glowing. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the empath, the final phase is exactly that privilege. After all the pain, after all the loss, they finally step into the fullness of themselves. But the journey doesn't end there, because when the empath reaches this phase, something unexpected happens. They begin to attract different kinds of people, different kinds of relationships. They are no longer magnets for narcissists. They become magnets for authenticity, for truth, for love that feels safe and steady. And here lies the real twist. What once felt like the end of their story was actually the beginning. When the empath first steps into life after narcissistic abuse, the world feels strangely unfamiliar. For years, they lived in a distorted reality where truth was twisted, emotions were weaponized, and love was conditional. Now, standing outside of it, they are like someone emerging from a long, dark tunnel into daylight. The brightness is blinding at first. Freedom doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like emptiness. There are mornings when the empath wakes up and instinctively expects chaos. A slammed door, an icy silence, a cutting remark. But instead, there is only stillness. That stillness feels foreign, even uncomfortable. It whispers, "Now what?" This is the space many survivors describe as the void, a place where the old identity no longer exists, but the new self has not fully formed. It is both terrifying and sacred. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of this void. He believed that when the old structures of the psyche collapse, it creates a fertile ground for transformation. He compared it to alchemy, the ancient practice of turning lead into gold. The empath, having endured so much, is now holding the lead of their suffering. And in this silence, they begin the process of turning it into gold. At first, though, the process feels more like grief than transformation. The empath grieves not only the loss of the narcissist, but also the loss of who they used to be. They grieve the years wasted trying to earn love. They grieve the innocence of believing that if they just loved enough, everything would be okay. They grieve the version of themselves that never knew such pain. Grief is heavy, but it is necessary. Without grieving, the empath cannot move forward. They must sit with their sorrow, allowing the tears to cleanse wounds that words cannot reach. And here, in the rawness of grief, something remarkable happens. The empath begins to feel themselves again, not the distorted reflection created by the narcissist, but their true essence. This is when shadow work begins, often without the empath even realizing it. Jung described the shadow as the part of ourselves we reject, repress, or deny. For the empath, the shadow often contains anger, boundaries, selfishness, and power, all things they were taught to suppress. But now, in this final phase, the shadow knocks at the door. It whispers, "You need me." At first, the empath resists. They don't want to be angry, because anger was always labeled as wrong. They don't want to say no, because no always felt like rejection. They don't want to stand alone, because standing alone once meant danger. But as they sit in silence, they realize the shadow is not the enemy. It is the missing piece. The empath begins to practice saying no in small ways. No to unnecessary obligations. No to toxic people. No to self-blame. Each no feels strange but liberating. They begin to allow themselves to feel anger, not as destruction, but as fuel for protection. They realize anger is not bad. It is sacred fire that keeps them safe. Slowly, they integrate this side of themselves, and in doing so, they become whole. The narcissist once fed on the empath's inability to set limits. But now, those limits rise like strong walls. The empath no longer leaks energy into the void of someone else's neediness. They conserve it. They channel it into creativity, into self-discovery, into growth. And with this newfound strength comes an inner calm the narcissist could never touch. Imagine a river once dammed and redirected by someone else's control. Now the dam is gone, and the river flows freely, carving its own path. This is the empath's soul in the final phase, untamed, authentic, unstoppable. But here is where the transformation deepens. As the empath integrates their shadow, they also rediscover their light. They remember what it feels like to laugh without fear, to dream without shame, to love without bargaining. They begin to reconnect with passions they had abandoned: painting, writing, dancing, nature, friendships. Life feels colorful again, not because someone else painted it for them, but because they hold the brush. And in this renewal, the empath learns a profound truth. Self-love is not selfish. It is survival. It is the foundation of every healthy relationship. It is the very thing the narcissist tried to strip away, because a person who truly loves themselves cannot be controlled. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The empath, in this phase, no longer calls pain their fate. They see the unconscious patterns that once drove them, the old wounds, the childhood echoes, the belief that love must be earned. And by bringing those shadows into the light, they take control of their destiny. This doesn't mean the journey is free of struggle. There are days when the empath still doubts, still fears, still aches for what was lost. Healing is not linear. It is a spiral, just like the path that brought them here. But even on the hardest days, something has changed. The empath no longer abandons themselves. They no longer silence their needs. They no longer trade their soul for someone else's comfort. And slowly, this consistency becomes power. The empath begins to feel stronger, more grounded, more whole. They walk differently, speak differently, choose differently. People notice it, often before the empath even does. Friends might say, "You seem calmer," or "There's something different about you." That something is the quiet strength of someone who has met their shadow and come out alive. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this phase is what happens next. The empath begins to see others more clearly, not through the fog of need or fear, but through the clarity of truth. They recognize manipulation for what it is. They sense authenticity when it's present. They no longer confuse chaos with passion or control with love. Their radar sharpens, but instead of making them cynical, it makes them wise. And wisdom attracts a new kind of life. Genuine friends, supportive partners, communities built on respect, opportunities aligned with their soul. The empath, once magnetized to narcissists, now attracts authenticity. It's as though the universe responds to their inner shift by sending them people and experiences that match their healed energy. This is the gold Jung spoke of, the treasure hidden in the wounds. The empath's suffering was real, but it was also the very thing that carved out space for transformation. Without the darkness, they would never have discovered their own light. The empath no longer asks, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead, they begin to ask, "What has this taught me?" And that question opens the door to meaning, to purpose, to the final and most powerful stage of their journey. There comes a day in every empath's healing when they realize something extraordinary. The very wounds that nearly destroyed them have become the source of their greatest strength. It doesn't happen in a single flash of insight. It emerges slowly, like dawn after a long night, until one day they look back and realize they are no longer the same person who once begged for love in the shadows of abuse. The final phase is not just about freedom from the narcissist. It's about stepping into a deeper truth, a calling almost, that Carl Jung hinted at in his idea of the wounded healer. Jung believed that those who have suffered deeply carry within them a unique ability to help others heal, not because they are perfect, but precisely because they have walked through darkness and survived. Their scars are not signs of weakness. They are maps of survival, proof that the soul can endure what once felt unbearable. For the empath, this realization comes like a quiet revelation. They notice that when they share their story, others lean in. When they speak of their pain, others nod with recognition. When they show their strength, others feel hope. Suddenly, their suffering no longer feels meaningless. It feels like medicine, hard won but powerful. At first, the empath may resist this role. They might say, "I don't want to be defined by my pain. I don't want to be the wounded one." And they are right. Healing is not about clinging to the wound. It is about transforming it. The wounded healer is not someone who lives in the past, but someone who uses the lessons of the past to bring light into the present. This is where purpose begins to bloom. Some empaths find it in art, painting canvases filled with colors that once only existed in their imagination. Others find it in writing, their journals becoming books that speak to thousands of silent hearts. Some turn to counseling, coaching, or teaching, guiding others who are still lost in the fog of abuse. And some simply live their truth quietly, becoming living examples of resilience for their children, friends, or communities. The form doesn't matter. What matters is the energy, the quiet power of someone who knows pain and yet chooses love, who knows betrayal and yet chooses trust, who knows despair and yet chooses hope. This choice, repeated day after day, becomes a kind of spiritual authority. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The empath in their final phase embodies this. They do not pretend darkness doesn't exist. They have seen it, lived with it, even loved it. But they are no longer controlled by it. They integrate it. And in doing so, they carry a light that feels real, grounded, unshakable. This transformation also changes how the empath loves. Once, their love was desperate, tangled with fear, filled with self-sacrifice. Now, their love is steady, clear, and boundaried. They no longer confuse giving with losing or kindness with self-erasure. They love not to be chosen, but because love is simply who they are. And this love attracts partners who meet them in truth, not in manipulation. It is a breathtaking shift. Imagine a person once chained in a dark cellar, believing that scraps of affection were all they deserved. Now, picture that same person walking freely through an open field, sunlight warming their skin, laughter bubbling from their chest, surrounded by people who see them clearly and love them without condition. That is the empath in the final phase, reborn, radiant, whole. But perhaps the most powerful part of this phase is forgiveness. Not the shallow forgiveness preached as an obligation, but the deep forgiveness that comes when the wound is no longer raw. The empath doesn't excuse the narcissist's cruelty. They don't deny the damage, but they release the bitterness because they no longer want to carry it. They see that holding on to hate is just another chain, and they are done with chains. Forgiveness here is not for the narcissist. It is for themselves. It is the final act of freedom, the decision to no longer let the past define the present. Jung believed that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from reconciliation. And in forgiving, not forgetting, not excusing, but forgiving, the empath reconciles with their own story. They accept that the darkness shaped them, but it does not own them. This is when life begins to expand in ways the empath never imagined. Opportunities open, creativity flows, relationships deepen. There is a new ease in how they walk through the world, as if every step is lighter because the burdens are gone. People sense this energy. Some are inspired, some are comforted, and some, especially those who thrive on control, are unsettled by it. But the empath no longer adjusts themselves to fit others' comfort. They live in alignment with truth, and that truth becomes magnetic. And yet, there is one more gift in this phase, perhaps the most surprising of all: gratitude. The empath begins to feel grateful, not for the abuse itself, but for the strength it awakened. They see that the very experiences that broke them also carved out space for resilience, wisdom, and depth. They realize they know themselves in ways they never would have otherwise. They are more compassionate, more discerning, more alive. It is a strange paradox: pain as the teacher, darkness as the guide. But this paradox is at the heart of Jung's psychology and at the heart of the empath's final phase. The wound was real, but so was the healing. And in that healing lies a kind of beauty no superficial life could ever offer. Now, the empath is not simply someone who survived narcissistic abuse. They are someone who carries wisdom forged in fire. They are someone who understands the human soul in its rawest form. They are someone who can stand in both light and shadow without losing themselves. They are, in Jung's words, individuated whole. And so, the empath's journey comes full circle. From innocence to betrayal, from pain to awakening, from shadow to wholeness. The final phase is not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a life lived in truth, in strength, in love that is no longer chained by fear. So here we are, at the very end of this story, or perhaps at the beginning of a new one. The empath has walked through fire, endured the suffocating grip of narcissistic abuse, faced the shadows within, and stepped into the light of their final phase. And yet, when we look closely, we see that this final phase is not about endings at all. It is about becoming. Carl Jung believed that the true journey of life is individuation, the process of becoming who we were always meant to be. The empath's journey mirrors this perfectly. They start out fragmented, defined by old wounds, trapped in cycles they do not understand. They suffer, they break, they grieve, and then, through pain and self-reflection, they integrate. They embrace their shadow, they reclaim their voice, they rediscover their worth. They do not return to who they were before the abuse. They emerge as someone entirely new. And this is the gift hidden in the suffering. The empath does not just survive. They transcend. Think of the butterfly. Before it spreads its wings, it is only a caterpillar, crawling low, vulnerable, limited. Then comes the cocoon, a place of darkness, of dissolution, where the old self literally melts away. It looks like destruction, but in truth, it is transformation. When the cocoon breaks, the butterfly is born, not despite the darkness, but because of it. The empath's final phase is this moment of flight. After being confined in the cocoon of manipulation and pain, after dissolving everything they thought they were, they finally emerge with wings. Wings of self-love, wings of truth, wings of wisdom that no one can take away. This transformation also carries a profound moral. Pain can destroy you, or it can shape you into someone stronger, wiser, more compassionate. The difference lies in whether you let it harden your heart or open it. The empath, in their final phase, chooses the latter. They carry scars, yes, but those scars are not chains. They are reminders of battles won, of strength discovered, of a soul that refused to be broken. And perhaps that is why their presence feels so powerful. You can sense it when you meet someone who has walked this path. They don't need to shout their strength. It radiates quietly in their calm, in their boundaries, in their unshakable sense of self. They no longer need to prove anything to anyone. They simply are. For those still trapped in the cycle, still caught in the fog of narcissistic abuse, the empath in their final phase becomes a beacon. They show what is possible. They prove that freedom exists, that healing is real, that the chains can be broken. And for those who have already begun their own healing, they offer a vision of what lies ahead, not just survival, but transformation. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The empath in their final phase has done exactly that. They have accepted not only their light, but their darkness, not only their compassion, but their anger, not only their joy, but their grief. In this acceptance, they become whole, and in their wholeness, they find peace. So if you are listening to this, and you see yourself in this story, remember, your final phase is waiting. It may feel far away. You may feel stuck in the chaos, drowning in doubt, blinded by the pain. But every tear you shed, every boundary you set, every moment of clarity you allow yourself is a step toward freedom. One day, you too will wake up and realize you are no longer the same person who once begged for love. One day, you too will spread your wings. And when you do, you will understand the truth Jung tried to teach us. We are not defined by what happened to us, but by what we choose to become. So, choose to become whole. Choose to become free. Choose to become yourself, fully and unapologetically. And now, as we close this journey together, I want to leave you with this thought. The final phase of the empath is not just about healing from narcissistic abuse. It is about discovering the deepest truth of your soul, that you are strong, you are worthy, and you are capable of creating a life filled with love that begins within you. If this story touched you, if it gave you strength or clarity, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Comment below and let us know where you are in your journey. Are you still in the storm? Are you breaking free? Or are you stepping into your final phase? Your words might be the spark of hope for someone else. And if you want to keep exploring these truths, to keep learning, healing, and growing, make sure to subscribe. Together, we can continue to walk this path, not alone, but side by side, with wisdom as our guide and resilience as our strength. Thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing this story to touch your heart. Until next time, take care of your soul, protect your light, and never forget, even in your darkest moments, you are becoming someone extraordinary.